August 6, 1945. The Imperial Palace, Tokyo, Japan. The report arrived at the Imperial Palace in the early afternoon, though the full magnitude of what had happened would not be clear for hours. A single American bomber had struck Hiroshima that morning. The city had been destroyed. Communications were down. Casualty estimates were impossible to calculate, but early reports suggested tens of thousands dead, possibly more. Emperor Hirohito sat in his private study, a modest room by imperial standards, surrounded by marine biology specimens and books. He was 44 years old, a slight, bespectacled man who had ruled Japan since 1926, though his actual power had always been limited by the military establishment that had dragged the nation into a catastrophic war. He had watched helplessly as his country conquered Manchuria, invaded China, attacked Pearl Harbor, and embarked on a campaign of expansion that had brought glory at first, then disaster. Now, reading the fragmentary reports from Hiroshima, Hirohito understood that something unprecedented had occurred. The Americans had used a new weapon, something beyond conventional bombs, something that had obliterated an entire city in a single flash of light. The reports spoke of a blinding explosion, a mushroom-shaped cloud rising miles into the sky, fires burning across the city, people vanishing in an instant, shadows burned into walls where human beings had stood. Hirohito set down the papers and removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. He was a man of science, an amateur marine biologist who had published papers on jellyfish and other marine life. He understood physics, understood that scientists had been theorizing about atomic energy for years. But to see it weaponized, to see an entire city destroyed in seconds, it was beyond anything he had imagined. Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal. Koichi Kido entered the room, his face grave. Kido was one of the few people Hirohito truly trusted, one of the few who understood the emperor's private doubts about the war, his growing conviction that Japan must find a way to end the conflict before the nation was completely destroyed. "Your Majesty," Kido said, bowing deeply, "I have additional reports from Hiroshima. The damage is catastrophic. The entire city center has been destroyed. We estimate at least 60,000 dead, possibly twice that number. And the Americans are claiming they used a new type of bomb, something they call an atomic bomb. They say it harnesses the power of the atom itself." Hirohito stood and walked to the window, looking out at the palace gardens. They were immaculate as always, carefully tended, a refuge of beauty and order in a world that had descended into chaos. He had spent many peaceful hours in those gardens, studying plants and insects, finding solace in the natural world when the burdens of his position became too heavy. "An atomic bomb," Hirohito said quietly, testing the words. "The scientists told me this was theoretically possible. They said that if you could split the atom, you could release enormous amounts of energy. But I never imagined it could be done so quickly, or with such devastating effect." He turned to face Kido. "Do we have any defense against such a weapon?" Kido shook his head. "No, Your Majesty. Our scientists have been working on their own atomic research, but they are years behind the Americans. We have no way to stop such an attack, no way to protect our cities. If the Americans have more of these bombs, and they claim they do, they could destroy every major city in Japan without ever setting foot on our soil." Hirohito closed his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Then the war is over. We have lost." It was the first time he had said those words aloud, though he had been thinking them for months. The fall of Saipan in 1944 had convinced him that Japan could not win. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945, which had killed more than 100,000 people in a single night, had reinforced that conviction. The loss of Okinawa, the destruction of the Japanese Navy, the relentless American advance, all of it pointed to inevitable defeat. But the military leadership had refused to accept reality. They spoke of fighting to the last man, of defending the home islands with suicidal determination, of inflicting such heavy casualties on the Americans that they would agree to a negotiated peace. They spoke of the Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, as if spiritual determination could overcome material superiority. Hirohito had listened to these arguments with growing despair. He knew that continued resistance meant the death of millions of Japanese civilians, the destruction of Japan's cities, the possible extinction of the Japanese people as a nation. But he also knew that his power to intervene was limited. The emperor was supposed to reign, not rule. He was a symbol, not a decision-maker. If he overstepped his constitutional role, he risked civil war, military coup, or his own assassination. But now, with Hiroshima destroyed by a weapon beyond imagination, Hirohito understood that he had no choice. He would have to intervene, would have to use his authority to end the war, regardless of the consequences. "Kido," Hirohito said, his voice firmer now, "we must convene the Supreme Council. We must discuss surrender terms immediately. I will not allow more cities to be destroyed. I will not allow the Japanese people to be annihilated because our military leaders are too proud to admit defeat." Kido bowed. "I will arrange it, Your Majesty, but you must understand, the military will resist. They will argue that we should continue fighting, that we should wait for the Soviet Union to mediate a peace, that surrender is unthinkable. They may not accept your intervention." Hirohito's jaw tightened. "Then I will make them accept it. I am the emperor. I am the voice of the ancestors, the living embodiment of Japan's continuity. If I command them to end the war, they must obey. They have no choice." He paused, then added quietly, "And if they refuse, if they attempt to continue the war against my wishes, then I will abdicate. I will remove myself from the throne and leave them to face the consequences of their stubbornness. But I will not be complicit in the destruction of Japan. I will not allow my reign to end with the extinction of my people." Kido looked startled. The emperor had never spoken so forcefully, had never threatened to use his authority in such a direct way. "Your Majesty, abdication would be... It would be preferable to presiding over genocide," Hirohito interrupted. "I have been too passive, Kido. I've allowed the military to lead us into disaster because I was afraid to assert myself, afraid to break with tradition, afraid to risk my position. But no more. Hiroshima has shown me what is at stake. If one bomb can destroy an entire city, what will happen if they drop 10 bombs? 20? Will there be anything left of Japan? Will there be anyone left to remember that we ever existed?" He walked back to his desk and picked up the reports again, reading through the descriptions of the destruction. "Listen to this, Kido. The city has ceased to exist. Buildings have been vaporized. People have been reduced to shadows on the pavement. The fires burn so hot that rescue workers cannot approach. The survivors are wandering in shock, their skin hanging from their bodies, begging for water. This is what we have brought upon our people. This is the result of our pride and our refusal to accept reality." Hirohito set down the papers and looked directly at Kido. "I bear responsibility for this. I am the emperor. I should have stopped this war years ago when it became clear we could not win. I should have overruled the military, should have insisted on peace, should have protected my people. But I was weak. I was afraid. And now Hiroshima has paid the price for my weakness." Kido said carefully, "Your Majesty, you are being too hard on yourself. The military has controlled policy for years. You did not have the power to stop them." "Then I should have found the power," Hirohito said, his voice rising with emotion. "I should have done something, anything, to prevent this catastrophe. And if I cannot prevent the next one, if I cannot stop the Americans from dropping more of these atomic bombs, then what is the point of being emperor? What is the point of this institution if it cannot protect the people it is supposed to serve?" He sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than his 44 years. "I think about the people of Hiroshima. Kido, the men, women, and children who woke up this morning expecting an ordinary day. They went to work, went to school, went about their lives, and then, in an instant, they were gone, vaporized, erased from existence. Their families will never find their bodies, never be able to bury them properly, never be able to perform the rituals that give meaning to death. They simply ceased to be. He looked up at Kido, his eyes wet with tears. How many of them were soldiers? How many were combatants who chose to fight? Most were civilians, children, elderly people, women, ordinary citizens who had no say in the decisions that led to this war. And they died because of those decisions, because of choices made by people like me, people in positions of power, who failed to stop the madness. Kido had never seen the emperor so emotional, so openly distressed. Hirohito had always maintained the imperial dignity, the reserve and composure expected of his position. But now, confronted with the magnitude of Hiroshima's destruction, that facade had crumbled. "I have failed my people," Hirohito said quietly. "I have failed in my most fundamental duty as emperor, to protect Japan and ensure its survival. And now I must try to salvage what remains, to end this war before there is nothing left to save." Over the following days, Hirohito would learn more about the atomic bomb and its effects. He would receive reports about radiation sickness, about people who had survived the initial blast, but were dying slowly from an invisible poison. He would learn about the firestorm that had consumed what the bomb had not vaporized, about the hospitals overwhelmed with casualties, about the breakdown of all social order in the ruins of Hiroshima. And then, on August 9th, he would receive word that a second atomic bomb had been dropped, this time on Nagasaki. Another city destroyed, another 70,000 people dead. Another demonstration that the Americans had not just one atomic bomb, but many, and that they were willing to use them until Japan surrendered unconditionally. That same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, crushing the Japanese forces there with overwhelming superiority. The last hope of a negotiated peace through Soviet mediation vanished in hours. The Supreme Council met on the night of August 9th to 10th, and as Kido had predicted, the military leadership was divided. Some argued for continued resistance. Others acknowledged that surrender was inevitable but insisted on conditions: preservation of the imperial system, no occupation of Japan, Japanese management of disarmament, Japanese prosecution of war criminals. The meeting deadlocked. The military and civilian leaders could not agree. And so, in an unprecedented move, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki asked the emperor to intervene, to break the deadlock with an imperial decision. Hirohito stood before the assembled council, these men who had led Japan into war and now could not agree on how to end it. He was dressed in his military uniform, but his demeanor was that of a man burdened by sorrow rather than one asserting authority. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, and every man in the room strained to hear the words that would determine Japan's fate. "I've listened to all the arguments," Hirohito said. "I have considered all the options, and I have concluded that we must accept the Potsdam Declaration and surrender to the Allies. We must do so immediately, before more atomic bombs are dropped, before more cities are destroyed, before more of our people are killed." He paused, and in the silence, several of the military officers looked as if they wanted to object. But the emperor continued before they could speak. "I understand the arguments for continued resistance. I understand the desire to preserve our honor, to avoid the humiliation of unconditional surrender, to protect the Kokutai, the national polity, and the imperial system. But I also understand what continued resistance will mean. It will mean the destruction of more cities, the death of millions of our people, the possible extinction of Japan as a nation." His voice grew stronger, more forceful. "I have seen the reports from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I have read the descriptions of what these atomic bombs can do. And I tell you now, we have no defense against such weapons. We cannot protect our people. We cannot win this war. All we can do by continuing to fight is ensure that more Japanese die, that more cities are destroyed, that more suffering is inflicted on a population that has already endured so much. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each council member. Some of you speak of fighting to the last man, of defending the home islands with our lives. But I ask you, what will that accomplish? Will it bring victory? No. Will it preserve Japan? No. It will only ensure that when the war finally ends, there will be nothing left. No cities, no industry, no people. Just ruins and graves. Hirohito's voice dropped, becoming almost conversational. I think of the children, the young people who have their whole lives ahead of them. If we continue this war, most of them will die. They will die in air raids, in atomic explosions, in the fighting on the beaches when the Americans invade. And those who survive will inherit a wasteland, a nation so devastated that it may never recover. He paused, gathering himself. I cannot allow that to happen. I will not allow that to happen. As emperor, I have a responsibility to ensure the survival of Japan and the Japanese people. That responsibility outweighs any concern for honor or pride, or the preservation of my own position. One of the military leaders, General Kurachika Anami, spoke up. Your Majesty, with respect, surrender will mean the end of Japan as we know it. The Americans will occupy our country, will impose their values on us, will destroy our traditions and our way of life. We will become a vassal state, a colony. Is that preferable to fighting to the end? Hirohito looked at Anami with something like pity. General, Japan will not end with surrender. We will survive. We will rebuild. We will adapt to the new world that emerges from this war. But we can only do those things if there are Japanese people left alive to do them. If we fight to the end, there will be no Japan to preserve, no traditions to maintain, no way of life to protect. There will only be death and destruction. He straightened, assuming the full dignity of his imperial office. I've made my decision. We will accept the Potsdam Declaration. We will surrender to the Allies, and we will do so in a way that preserves what can be preserved, our people, our culture, our future. The war is over. It is time to think about peace, about rebuilding, about ensuring that Japan survives into the next generation. The room was silent. No one dared to contradict the emperor when he spoke with such finality. The decision had been made. Japan would surrender. But Hirohito was not finished. He had one more thing to say, something that revealed the depth of his personal anguish over what had happened. I want you all to understand something, he said quietly. This decision brings me no satisfaction. I take no pride in it. I am surrendering because I have no choice, because the alternative is the destruction of everything I'm sworn to protect. But I will carry the burden of this decision for the rest of my life. I will carry the burden of every Japanese life lost in this war, every city destroyed, every family torn apart. That is my responsibility as emperor, and I accept it. His voice broke slightly. When I think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when I think of the people who died there, I am filled with sorrow and shame. Sorrow for their suffering, shame that I could not prevent it. Those deaths are on my conscience. They will haunt me until the day I die. And if accepting that burden, if living with that guilt, is the price I must pay to save the rest of Japan, then I will pay it gladly. He looked around the room one last time. We have brought great suffering to our own people and to the peoples of Asia. We have pursued a war that we could not win, driven by pride and ambition and a refusal to accept our limitations. And now we must face the consequences of our choices. We must surrender, must accept occupation, must rebuild our nation from the ruins. It will be difficult, it will be humiliating, but it is necessary, and it is my command. With that, Emperor Hirohito left the room, leaving the Supreme Council to work out the details of the surrender. Over the next few days, he would record a radio address to the Japanese people, the first time most of them would hear his voice. In that address, he would announce the surrender, would speak of enduring the unendurable and bearing the unbearable, would ask his people to accept defeat with dignity. Some military officers would refuse to accept the surrender, would attempt a coup to prevent it. But the coup would fail, and on August 15th, 1945, the Emperor's broadcast would be heard across Japan. The war would be over. In the years that followed, Hirohito would remain emperor under the new constitution imposed by the American occupation. He would be transformed from a divine figure into a constitutional monarch, a symbol of Japan's continuity but without political power. He would never be prosecuted for war crimes, a decision made by General Douglas MacArthur to maintain stability in occupied Japan. Hirohito would live until 1989, reigning for 63 years, the longest reign in Japanese history. He would witness Japan's transformation from a devastated nation into an economic powerhouse, would see his country become a democracy, would watch as the wounds of war slowly healed. But he would never forget Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In his private conversations, in his diaries, in his rare moments of candor, he would return again and again to those two cities, to the decision to surrender, to the burden of responsibility he carried. On that August day in 1945, when he first learned that an atomic bomb had destroyed Hiroshima, Emperor Hirohito understood that the world had changed forever. He understood that Japan had lost the war, and he understood that his duty was no longer to preserve Japan's pride or honor, but simply to ensure that Japan and the Japanese people survived. "The war is over," he had said. "We have lost." It was the truth, spoken by a man who had finally found the courage to face reality, to overrule the military establishment, to use his authority to save what remained of his nation. The atomic bomb had ended the war, but it had also ended the old Japan, the Imperial Japan that had sought to dominate Asia. In its place would emerge a new Japan, democratic and peaceful, rebuilt from the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Emperor Hirohito, the man who had presided over both the disaster and the rebirth, would carry the memory of those ashes with him for the rest of his long life.